The fire started not with a bang, but with a whisper. A faint, acrid smell that cut through the familiar scent of pine and expensive leather that permeated the Blackwood Mountain Lodge. I was on my knees, running a hand over the final seam of the herringbone floor I'd spent the last 3 weeks laying in the new executive wing. It was late, well past midnight, and the only reason I was still here was a stubborn refusal to leave a job 99% finished. One more pass with the weighted roller, one more wipe down, and I could go home to my daughter, Maya. A weight lived in my head those days. A constant, low-grade hum of anxiety about money, about the future, about the notice taped to the inside of my apartment door. The building had been sold. The new owners were converting the units to luxury condos, which was a bitter irony given that I spent my days building luxury for other people. We had 60 days.
60 days to find a new place to live, a new workshop for my business, all in a city where rent was a predatory beast. Every extra hour I worked, every splinter I dug out of my palm, was a small, desperate prayer for a miracle. The smell grew stronger, accompanied by a strange, distant crackling, like a bonfire heard through a thick wall. I stood up, my knees popping in protest. The hallway outside the suite was empty, the sconce lights casting long, distorted shadows. The silence of the lodge at this hour was usually profound, a blanket of wealth and quiet privilege. Tonight, it felt different. Tense. My life was a small, contained thing. It was me and Maya. It was the scent of sawdust on my clothes and the taste of the cheap coffee I brewed every morning. It was bedtime stories and scraped knees and the quiet pride of turning a stack of raw lumber into something beautiful and solid. It was a good life, a life I loved, but it was a life lived on the edge of a razor. I always felt like I was one bad month, one lost client, one eviction notice away from failing her. This job, installing the custom flooring and cabinetry at the new Vance Corporation Lodge, was supposed to be the score that gave us a cushion, a real cushion. A thin wisp of gray smoke curled under the door at the far end of the hall. My heart did a strange, stuttering skip. Not a panicked thump, but a cold, heavy drop. Smoke. The crackling was louder now. It wasn't a bonfire. It was the sound of a building being eaten alive. My first thought, a bolt of pure, selfish terror, was of Maya. She was safe, home with Mrs. Gable from next door, but the instinct was primal. I had to get out. I had to get back to her. I turned and started for the service stairs at the other end of the hall, my toolbox forgotten on the floor. My boots were heavy, my movements sluggish, my mind trying to catch up with the reality of the situation. Then, a muffled shout came from behind one of the doors, a woman's voice, sharp with panic. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" I stopped. My entire being screamed at me to keep going. A fire in a place this big, this new? It shouldn't happen. Sprinklers, alarms, state-of-the-art systems. But the silence was the most damning evidence. No alarms were ringing. No sprinklers were raining down. There was only the growing roar and the smell of burning plastic and wood. "Go," a voice in my head urged. "Think of Maya." But my feet were rooted to the floor I had just laid. I thought of the blueprints I'd studied for weeks. The layout of this wing burned into my memory. I knew the emergency exits, the service corridors, the places where the walls were thickest. I was a carpenter, a nobody, a guy with sawdust in his hair and an eviction notice on his door. But right now, in this specific, terrifying moment, I was the most qualified person in the world. "Hello?" I called back, my voice rough. "I'm here." The door to the presidential suite, the one I'd been working adjacent to, was unlocked. I pushed it open into a cloud of thickening smoke. The suite was a cavern of opulence, now rendered terrifying by the flickering orange glow coming from the main living area.
and in the middle of the foyer, a woman was on the floor, struggling to get up. She was dressed in a silk robe, her dark hair a mess around her face. Even in the dim, chaotic light, I recognized her. Isabel Vance, CEO of the corporation that owned this whole mountain. Her picture had been in the design briefs, a severe, unsmiling woman with eyes that could cut steel. The Ice Queen, the trade magazines called her. On the floor, coughing, her face streaked with soot, she just looked scared. "My ankle," she gasped, pointing to her foot, which was bent at an unnatural angle. "I fell. The power went out. I tripped in the dark." The roar of the fire was a physical presence now, a beast on the other side of the room. Heat rolled toward us in waves. I could see flames licking up the heavy velvet curtains. We didn't have minutes. We had seconds. "We have to go. Now," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. I moved toward her, my mind racing. Service stairs, back of the building, away from the main lobby. She pushed herself up with her arms, her face contorting in pain as she put weight on her injured foot. She collapsed back with a sharp cry. "I can't," she breathed, her voice a ragged whisper. The control she was famous for was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear that I recognized because I felt it in my own bones. "I can't walk." She looked up at me, her sharp, intelligent eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. The fire was getting louder, closer.
The ceiling above the living area groaned. "Go," she said. It wasn't a command. It was a plea, a release. She was letting me off the hook. She had assessed the situation, calculated the odds, and decided one survivor was better than none. The CEO making a final, brutal executive decision. Typical. But her eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of a CEO. They were the eyes of a person who was utterly alone and about to die. I looked at her, this powerful woman, crumpled on the floor of a monument to her own success, and I didn't see Isabel Vance, the Ice Queen. I saw the terror she was trying so hard to hide beneath a layer of pragmatism. I saw the slight tremble in her hands, and in that moment, the choice wasn't a choice at all. Leaving her wasn't an option. It wasn't in my wiring. Maybe it was the part of me that was a father, the part that knew you don't leave people behind. Ever. "No," I said. The word was flat, absolute. Before she could argue, before I could second-guess myself, I bent down. "Put your arms around my neck," I ordered. There was no time for gentleness. I hooked one arm under her knees and the other around her back, lifting her. She was lighter than I expected, a fragile weight against my chest. She let out a small gasp of either pain or surprise and buried her face in the crook of my neck, her hands clinging to my shirt. The fabric was cheap cotton, already damp with sweat. Her silk robe was impossibly smooth against my rough, calloused hands. The contrast was a dizzying, irrelevant detail in the face of the inferno. I turned and ran. The smoke was a physical wall, hot and choking. I pulled the collar of my shirt up over my mouth and nose, trying to shield her face with my shoulder. I moved on instinct, my mental map of the building guiding my feet. The main hall was impassable, a tunnel of orange flame. I kicked open a service door I knew was there, leading into a concrete stairwell. It was still mostly clear, a stark gray chute in the midst of the chaos. Down we went, my legs pumping, my lungs screaming for air. Each step jarred her, and I could feel her wince, but she didn't make a sound. She just held on tighter. The air grew cooler, cleaner as we descended. 2 floors. 3. Finally, a door with a glowing green exit sign above it. I shouldered it open, and we stumbled out into the cool, clean night air. We were behind the lodge, near the kitchens and the loading docks. People were screaming, running. The whole back half of the building was engulfed in flames that shot 100 feet into the night sky,
turning the darkness into a hellish twilight. I didn't stop until we were a safe distance away, near a line of pine trees at the edge of the parking lot. I gently lowered her to the ground, propping her up against the trunk of a tree. My body was humming with adrenaline, my lungs burning. I coughed, a deep, rattling sound, trying to clear the smoke from my throat. She was looking at the burning building, her building, with a blank, stunned expression. Her face was pale under the soot, her perfect corporate mask completely gone. She was just a woman in a silk robe with a broken ankle, sitting on the damp ground, watching her empire burn. I shrugged off my flannel jacket, the one I'd had for 10 years, worn soft and frayed at the cuffs, and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled of sawdust and me. It was a hopelessly inadequate gesture. She finally turned her head and looked at me. Her gaze was intense, searching. The fear was still there, but something else was creeping in. Confusion, disbelief. "You," she started, her voice hoarse. "You should have left." I just shook my head, too breathless to speak. I sat down on the ground a few feet away, my back against another tree, and watched the fire trucks finally arrive, their sirens wailing a song that was far too late. I pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, but it worked. One new message. Maya fell asleep on the couch. Sweet dreams. Mrs. G. A wave of relief so profound it almost made me sick washed over me. She was safe. My world was safe. I leaned my head back against the rough bark of the pine tree, closed my eyes, and for the first time since I'd smelled the smoke, I let myself feel the terror I had been holding at bay. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the thought of what could have happened, what almost did. When I opened my eyes again, Isabel Vance was still watching me. Her expression was unreadable in the flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place was someone I didn't know at all. And for some reason, that felt more dangerous than the fire. The aftermath was a blur of organized chaos. Paramedics swarmed the area, their voices calm and professional amidst the panicked cries of hotel guests. One of them made a beeline for us, his eyes immediately locking onto Isabel's ankle, which was already swelling to a grotesque size. "Ma'am, we need to get you to the triage center," he said, his tone respectful but firm. Isabel didn't look at him. Her eyes were still on me. "He saved my life," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a strange authority even in its raspy state. The paramedic glanced at me, a quick, dismissive appraisal. I was just another guy in a dirty shirt covered in soot. He probably thought I was one of the kitchen staff. He wasn't wrong, not really. I was just a contractor, a pair of hands. "We need to get you stabilized," he insisted, gesturing to a waiting stretcher. As two other EMTs came to help, Isabel finally broke her gaze from mine. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp enough to make them pause. She fumbled with the pocket of my jacket that was still draped over her shoulders. It was an empty gesture. The jacket had no pockets to speak of. Her brow furrowed in frustration. She was a woman used to solving problems, to being in command, and this powerlessness was a language she didn't speak. "I need your name," she said, looking back at me. It wasn't a question, it was a demand for a piece of data she required. "Leo," I said. "Leo Thorne." "Leo Thorne," she repeated, committing it to memory. "I won't forget this." It sounded less like a promise and more like a vow, or a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be settled. They lifted her onto the stretcher, and as they carried her away toward the flashing lights and the sea of emergency personnel, she kept her eyes on me until she was swallowed by the crowd.
I was left standing by the tree, alone, wearing a smoke-stained t-shirt in the freezing mountain air.
My jacket, my old, worn-out jacket, was gone, carried away with the billionaire CEO. I felt a strange sense of loss, not for the jacket, but for the sudden, jarring return to my own reality. I was just Leo Thorne, carpenter, a guy who needed to call his babysitter and figure out how he was going to get his tools back, assuming they weren't a pile of molten metal. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the phantom smell of smoke in my nostrils. I found a shuttle bus that was taking evacuated staff and guests down the mountain to a temporary shelter in town. The entire ride, I stared out the window at the dark trees. The face of Isabel Vance as she said, "Go," burned into my mind. 2 days later, my world had shrunk back to its normal size. The fire at the Blackwood Lodge was front-page news, a multi-million-dollar disaster. The official story was an electrical fault in the West Wing. Investigators were praising the rapid evacuation, claiming no serious injuries. They mentioned an ankle fracture for a high-profile guest, no mention of a carpenter, which was fine by me. I had enough problems without being dragged into a corporate news cycle. My biggest problem was sitting on my small kitchen table, a formal, cream-colored envelope with the Vance Corporation logo embossed in silver. My hands, which could plane a piece of oak to 1/1000th of an inch, felt clumsy and thick as I opened it. Inside was a check. The number on it made my breath catch in my throat. It was more money than I made in 2 years, enough to solve my housing problem, to buy a new truck, to give Maya the kind of security I only dreamed of. With the check was a simple, stiff card. "Thank you, IV." I stared at the check for a long time. It felt heavy, like it wasn't made of paper, but of obligation. This was the settlement, the closing of the account. I had performed a service, and this was the payment. It was clean, corporate, and utterly impersonal. It was exactly what I should have expected. And it made my stomach churn. I put the check back in the envelope and shoved it in a drawer with my unpaid bills. I couldn't cash it. I didn't know why, not exactly. It felt wrong. It felt like taking blood money, though I couldn't say for what. It felt like it erased the humanity of the moment, turning a desperate, shared experience of survival into a simple transaction. It was her way of saying, "We're even." But we weren't. Not even close. That afternoon, another call came. This time, it was a crisp female voice identifying herself as Ms. Vance's personal assistant. "Ms. Vance would like to know if you are available to meet with her tomorrow at 10 a.m., the voice chirped, devoid of any emotion. My first instinct was to say no. I had work to do, calls to make about finding a new workshop. I didn't want to be part of her world of assistants and scheduled meetings. "I'm not sure," I started to say. "She insists," the assistant cut in, a hint of steel in her tone. "A car will be waiting for you outside your address." She recited my address back to me, a stark reminder that they knew exactly who and where I was. There was no escaping it. The next morning, a black town car, so clean it seemed to repel the city's grime, was purring at the curb outside my building. The driver, a man in a black suit, held the door for me. I felt absurdly out of place in my cleanest work pants and a new shirt I'd bought special for the occasion. It still felt like a costume. The leather seats of the car smelled like money. As we drove, I watched my neighborhood of brick walk-ups and bodegas give way to the glass and steel canyons of downtown. The Vance Corporation headquarters was a monument to power, a skyscraper that pierced the clouds. I was escorted to the top floor, to a corner office with windows that looked out over the entire city. It was a God's eye view, designed to make you feel both powerful and insignificant. Isabel Vance was sitting behind a massive glass desk. She wore a sharp gray pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. A sleek, high-tech medical boot was on her injured foot, which was propped up on a small stool. The only sign of the fire was a faint, almost invisible scar on her temple, which she had tried to cover with makeup. The Ice Queen was back in her throne room. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice cool and measured. "Thank you for coming." "Leo is fine," I said, my own voice sounding rough and out of place in the sterile, silent office. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the vast, plush carpet. She gestured to a chair opposite her desk. "Please." I sat. The silence stretched. She was observing me, her eyes analytical, as if she were trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the soot-covered figure from her memory. "You didn't cash the check," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No." "Why not?" I shifted in the uncomfortable chair. How could I explain it? That it felt cheap? That it felt like an ending when some part of me, some foolish, illogical part, didn't want it to be over? "It was too much," I said finally, the words inadequate. A flicker of something, annoyance, confusion, crossed her face. "It was a fraction of what your life is worth, which you risked for mine. By any metric, it was insufficient." Metrics. She was still thinking in metrics. "It wasn't a transaction, Ms. Vance," I said quietly. "I'm not an employee you're giving a bonus to. I was just there." She leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "My brother seems to think you're an opportunist, that you're waiting for a bigger payout. A lawsuit, perhaps." The words were a slap. "Your brother wasn't there," I said, a bit of an edge to my voice now. I thought of the condescending face I'd seen in photos, the man who was probably sipping champagne in the lobby while his sister was trapped. "No," she agreed, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "He was not." She paused, her gaze dropping to the city below. "The board is calling for an independent review. The insurance investigators are picking everything apart. My position..." She trailed off, then looked back at me. "I'm in a precarious situation, Leo. The fire is being used against me. By my brother, by rivals on the board. They say it shows a lack of oversight." I didn't know what to say. This was her world, a world of boardroom battles and corporate intrigue that was as foreign to me as the surface of the moon. "I need something from you," she said, her tone shifting back to business. "And I'm prepared to compensate you for it." Here it comes, I thought, the real proposition. "I need you to have dinner with me," she said. I stared at her, completely bewildered. "Dinner?" "Yes, tomorrow night, at a restaurant called Alinari. It will be very public." She saw the confusion on my face and elaborated, a hint of weariness in her voice. "The story of the heroic carpenter who saved the CEO is useful. It reframes the narrative from one of corporate failure to one of human drama, of survival. You, Leo, are good PR." My stomach dropped. So that's what this was. I wasn't a hero. I was a prop, a tool to be used in her power struggle with her brother. It was worse than the check. It was colder. "You want to use me," I said, the words tasting like ash. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I prefer the term mutually beneficial arrangement. You get a very public thank you from the CEO you saved. It makes you look noble, not opportunistic. It silences people like my brother. And in return for your time, my company's foundation would be very pleased to solve your housing situation. Permanently." She knew. Of course she knew. She had run a complete background check. She knew about the eviction, about Maya, about the balance in my bank account. She had laid all my vulnerabilities out on her big glass desk and was leveraging them. It was a brilliant move. A checkmate. She was offering me the one thing I couldn't refuse: a home for my daughter. All I had to do was sell a little piece of my soul. I had to let her turn the most terrifying and oddly profound moment of my life into a publicity stunt. I thought of Maya's room, the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd painstakingly stuck to her ceiling. I thought of the panic that seized me every time I looked at that eviction notice. What was a little bit of pride compared to that? "One dinner?" I asked, my voice flat. "To start," she said, a hint of a wry smile on her lips. "We'll see how it goes." I looked out the window at the city sprawling below, a concrete jungle where you either ate or were eaten, and I thought of her, on the floor, in the smoke, saying, "Go." She had been willing to sacrifice herself. Now she was asking me to sacrifice a little dignity to help her survive in a different kind of fire. "Fine," I said, the word feeling like a surrender. "One dinner." The restaurant, Alinari, was the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu. The air was thick with the scent of money and truffles. I felt like an imposter in the blazer I'd been forced to buy, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar across my shoulders. A car had picked me up again, and I'd been coached by Isabel's assistant on the phone. "Just follow Ms. Vance's lead. Answer politely. Don't volunteer information." I felt less like a dinner guest and more like a carefully managed asset. Isabel was already there, seated at a secluded but highly visible table. She looked magnificent. She wore a simple black dress that probably cost more than my truck. Her hair was down, soft around her shoulders, and the severe corporate mask was replaced by a pleasant, neutral smile. It was a performance, and she was a master. "Leo, you look very nice," she said as I sat down. Her eyes did a quick professional scan, approving of the assistant's choice of attire for me. "I feel like I'm playing a part in a play," I admitted, my voice low. Her smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "We all are, to some extent. Tonight, our roles are simply grateful survivor and humble hero. Try the sea bass. It's what they're known for." The dinner was an exercise in surrealism. We made small talk, carefully curated conversation that could be overheard by the surrounding tables. She asked about my work, and I described the process of selecting wood, the satisfaction of a perfect joint. I was careful to avoid mentioning my financial troubles or the impending eviction. She talked about the company's new charitable initiatives, painting a picture of a benevolent corporation. It was all a lie. A beautiful, well-crafted fiction. But then, something shifted. In a lull between the appetizer and the main course, after the hovering waiter had retreated, she leaned forward slightly. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I blinked. "For what?" "For this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "For making you a part of my mess. It's unconscionable. But I'm not sorry I'm doing it. Does that make sense?" It was the first honest thing she'd said all night. It was a crack in the performance, a glimpse of the woman who had calculated her own odds of survival in a burning room. "You're fighting to survive," I said. "I get that." "My brother Julian," she said, her eyes darkening. "He's at the bar. He's been watching us since you arrived." I resisted the urge to look. "What does he want?" "To see me fail," she said simply. "He believes my father made a mistake giving me the company. He thinks I'm weak, sentimental." She looked at me then, a direct, piercing gaze. "He sees you as proof of that." Before I could respond, a shadow fell over our table. I looked up into the face of a handsome, smug-looking man in a suit that was even more expensive than Isabel's dress. He had the same dark hair and sharp eyes as her, but where her expression was controlled, his was openly condescending. Julian Vance. "Izzy," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I see you're entertaining. I didn't realize the company's charity work extended to dinner dates." He gave me a dismissive once-over, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Mr. Thorne, is it? The hero of the hour. I trust my sister is compensating you adequately for your time." The insult was designed to provoke, to make me look like a hired hand, a gigolo. My jaw tightened. I felt a hot flash of anger. I wanted to tell him where he could shove his condescension, but I looked at Isabel. Her face was a mask of calm, but I saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers were clenched around her water glass. She was holding herself together by a thread. I took a breath and gave Julian a calm, level look. "Your sister is a very brave woman," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "When the fire started, most people panicked. She was clear-headed. She was the one who kept me from making a mistake. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was the right one. I was repositioning the narrative, subtly shifting the power." Julian's smile faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd wanted a confrontation, a scene. Isabel looked at me, a flash of genuine surprise in her eyes. I continued, speaking directly to Julian but for her benefit. "She doesn't owe me anything. I was just in the right place at the right time. Anyone would have done the same." I paused. Well, almost anyone. The implication hung in the air between us. He had been there, at the lodge, and he had done nothing. His face hardened, the smugness replaced by a flash of cold fury. He knew he'd been outmaneuvered, and by a man he considered his social and intellectual inferior. "Enjoy your meal," he said, the words clipped. He turned and walked away without another word. The silence he left behind was heavy. Isabel slowly unclenched her hand. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe. Respect. "No one's ever done that before," she said softly. "Done what?" "Defended me," she said, a look of profound weariness on her face. "Not like that. Everyone in my life either wants something from me or is trying to take something away. They fight me, they challenge me, but they don't protect me." I felt a strange, powerful urge to reach across the table and take her hand, to tell her that it was okay. But I didn't. The gulf between our worlds was still too wide, a chasm of glass and money and expectation. "He's wrong about you," I said instead. "You're not weak." She gave me a small, sad smile. "Don't be so sure, Leo." After that, the pretense of the dinner fell away. We didn't talk about business or PR. She asked me about Maya, and I found myself telling her about my daughter's obsession with dinosaurs, about the funny way she narrated everything she did. I pulled out my cracked phone and showed her a picture. Maya, grinning, a smear of chocolate ice cream on her cheek. A genuine, unforced smile lit up Isabel's face. It transformed her, softening the sharp angles and warming her cool eyes. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with a surprising tenderness. "She's everything," I said simply, and it was the truest thing I'd ever said. In that moment, sitting in that ridiculously fancy restaurant, we weren't a CEO and a carpenter. We were just a man and a woman, sharing a quiet moment of connection in the middle of a war zone. The mutually beneficial arrangement suddenly felt a lot more complicated. The line between the performance and reality had begun to blur, and I had the terrifying premonition that if I wasn't careful, it would disappear altogether. The one dinner bled into two, then three. The arrangement, as she called it, continued. We were seen at a gallery opening, a charity auction, a quiet park near her apartment. Each outing was a calculated move in her corporate chess game, and each time I played my part. The press started calling me her mystery man, The carpenter hero. Julian's attempts to paint me as an opportunist were failing. The public narrative was firmly on our side. But between the public appearances, something else was happening. The quiet moments. The times when the performance stopped. She would have her driver drop me off, but we'd sit in the car for an extra 10, 20 minutes, just talking. The conversations started to drift away from the strategic and into the personal. I learned about the immense pressure she'd been under since her father's death, the weight of a legacy she never asked for. She told me about her failed marriage to a man who, in her words, loved the idea of me, but couldn't stand the reality. He'd wanted a beautiful hostess, a silent partner. He hadn't been prepared for a woman with more ambition and a sharper mind than his own. The divorce had been brutal, another weapon Julian used to question her judgment. In return, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't with anyone since my wife passed away. I told her about Sarah, about our whirlwind romance and the quiet, devastating grief that followed her illness. I told her about the fear of raising Maya alone, the constant, gnawing worry that I wasn't enough. One rainy Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. It was her personal number, not her assistant. "I'm going crazy," she said, her voice strained. "I've been in board meetings for 10 straight hours. I need to get out." "Where do you want to go?" I asked, expecting her to name some exclusive club or spa. "I don't know," she said, a note of desperation in her voice. "Somewhere real. Somewhere that isn't made of glass and steel." An idea, half-formed and probably stupid, came to me. "I have a place," I said. "It's not fancy." "I don't want fancy," she replied immediately. "I want real." An hour later, I was standing in my workshop. I had tidied up, but there was no hiding what it was, a place of work, of dust and labor. The air smelled of pine and wood glue. Stacks of cherry and walnut lined one wall. A half-finished rocking horse from Maya sat on my main workbench. When the black car pulled up, she got out. Alone. No driver. She was wearing simple jeans, a soft sweater, and a pair of sneakers, the medical boot gone, replaced by a discreet ankle brace. She looked younger, less intimidating. She looked tired. She stepped inside the workshop, her eyes wide as she took it all in. She ran a hand over a stack of rough sawn maple, her fingers tracing the grain. "This is where you work?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "This is it," I said, feeling a familiar pang of insecurity. To her, it must have seemed like a hovel. "It's incredible," she breathed. She walked over to the rocking horse, her movements tentative. "Did you make this?" "For my daughter's birthday. It's not finished yet." She reached out and touched the smooth, sanded curve of the horse's neck. Her shoulders, which were always so straight and rigid in her suits, seemed to slump, as if she were finally setting down an invisible weight. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's honest." I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. "Can I get you some coffee?" I asked. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I would love that." We sat on 2 overturned buckets in the middle of the workshop, drinking coffee from my mismatched mugs. The rain pattered against the single grimy window. It was a million miles away from the hushed elegance of Alinari, and it was 1,000 times more comfortable. She told me about the board meeting, about Julian's latest maneuver, an attempt to force a vote of no confidence. He had allies, and he was gaining ground. "He's telling everyone I'm distracted, emotional, that my judgment is compromised because of the fire, and because of you." "Maybe he's right," I said quietly, staring into my coffee. "Maybe I am a distraction." She reached out, her hand hovering in the air between us for a second before she rested it gently on my arm. Her touch was light, but it sent a jolt through me. "No, Leo," she said, her voice firm. "You're the opposite. You're the only thing that makes any sense right now. Coming here, this," she looked around the workshop, "this is like taking a breath after being underwater for too long." We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the rain and the distant city traffic. The professional distance between us had completely evaporated. There was no arrangement, no PR strategy. There was just us, two people in a dusty room, finding a moment of peace in the middle of a storm. There were moments of hesitation, small, aborted movements that spoke volumes more than our words. Once, walking through the park, a sudden gust of wind blew her hair across her face. My hand lifted instinctively to brush it away, but I stopped myself halfway, my fingers curling into a fist. I was the carpenter. She was the CEO. I was a temporary fixture in her life, a pawn in her game. I had to remember that. Another time, after a particularly grueling dinner where we were ambushed by a tabloid photographer, she looked so utterly exhausted in the car on the way home that I wanted nothing more than to pull her into my arms and tell her it would all be okay. But I kept my hands on my own knees, my knuckles white. She was leaning her head against the cool glass of the window, her eyes closed. She looked fragile, breakable. The protective instinct I felt was overwhelming, a fierce, primal urge that scared me with its intensity. It wasn't my place. I was falling for her. It was a stupid, reckless, impossible thing to do, like a moth falling for a star. We were from different universes. My world was small, tangible, made of wood and love and the daily struggle to get by. Her world was vast, abstract, made of stock prices and power plays. But the more I saw of the woman behind the title, the more I realized she was trapped in that world, not ruling it. The breaking point came at a family gathering, a birthday party for her father's brother, her uncle. It was held at the Vance family's ancestral estate, a place so grand it made the lodge look like a rustic cabin. Julian had insisted she come and that she bring me. It was a trap, and we both knew it. "You don't have to do this," I told her the night before. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice tight. "Running would be admitting he's right, that I'm ashamed, that you're my dirty little secret." Walking into that party was like stepping into a den of beautifully dressed lions. Every eye was on us. The air crackled with judgment. I felt their gazes stripping me down, assessing my cheap suit, my unpolished manners, my very existence in their world. I kept my hand on the small of Isabel's back, a small, steadying pressure. She felt impossibly tense beneath my touch. Julian found us by the sprawling French doors that opened onto a manicured garden. He was with an older man, handsome and cruel-looking, with the same predatory smile as Julian. "Isabel, darling," the older man purred, kissing the air next to her cheek. "You look stressed." He turned his cold eyes to me. "And this must be the fireman, Richard Sterling." He extended a hand. He was Isabel's ex-husband. I shook his hand. His grip was firm, a display of dominance. "Leo Thorne," I said, "and I'm a carpenter." Richard chuckled, a nasty, condescending sound. "A carpenter, of course. Izzy always did have a soft spot for strays. It's a wonder she didn't just have you put down after you served your purpose." The insult was so vile, so personal, that it sucked the air out of me. I saw Isabel flinch as if she'd been physically struck. All the color drained from her face. That was it. The line. He had crossed it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I stepped slightly in front of Isabel, shielding her. I looked Richard Sterling directly in the eye. "The difference between you and me," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm, "is that I know what she's worth, and it has nothing to do with her name or her money." I turned to Julian. "And you," I said, my voice dropping even lower. "You might share her blood, but you don't have an ounce of her strength. You call her weak because you're terrified of how strong she actually is." I didn't wait for a response. I took Isabel's hand. It was ice cold. "Let's go," I said softly. I led her through the silent, staring crowd, out the front door, and into the cool night air. We walked, hand in hand, down the long gravel driveway, leaving the black town car and the whole glittering, poisonous world behind us. We didn't say a word until we reached the main gates. She stopped, turning to face me. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," I said, my heart aching for her. "Don't be," she said, a strange, fierce look on her face. "He's right about one thing. I am emotional. I'm compromised." She took a step closer, her eyes searching mine. "This whole thing, this arrangement, it was supposed to be a strategy, a means to an end." "I know," I said. "It's not working, Leo," she said, her voice breaking. My stomach dropped. It was over. She was ending it. "I understand." "No," she said, shaking her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You don't. It's not working because it's not an arrangement anymore. Not for me." My own carefully constructed walls, the ones that told me I wasn't good enough, that this was all temporary, began to crumble. "For me either," I confessed, the words feeling huge and terrifying and liberating all at once. The space between us felt charged, electric, all the unspoken things, all the moments of hesitation, all the carefully guarded feelings were suddenly out in the open. She was looking at me not as a pawn or a hero, but as a man. And I was looking at her not as a CEO or a project, but as a woman I was hopelessly, completely falling for. The world of her family, of her ex-husband, of the board of directors, it all faded away. There was only the sound of our breathing and the cool night air. She didn't come to my workshop that night. She just disappeared. After I had called a taxi to take her back to her empty, sterile apartment, she'd given me a look I couldn't decipher and slipped into the back seat alone. For 2 days there was silence. No calls from her, no emails from her assistant. The black car didn't appear outside my building. The silence was worse than Julian's insults, worse than the fire. It was a void. I tried to work. I sanded the rocking horse until the wood was as smooth as silk, my mind a million miles away. I reread the eviction notice, the date looming closer. The check from Isabel was still in the drawer, a temptation I refused to touch. Taking it now would feel like the ultimate defeat, a final admission that everything between us had been a transaction after all. I was a fool. I had let myself believe that the chasm between our worlds could be bridged by a shared moment of trauma and a few honest conversations. I had let myself believe that the way she looked at me in my dusty workshop meant something more than a temporary escape. She was Isabel Vance. I was a carpenter facing eviction. The story was always going to end this way. She was retreating back to her world, sealing the breach, and I was left on the outside, exactly where I belonged. The quiet empath, the man who feels everything and gets nothing. It was the story of my life. On the third night, I was putting Maya to bed. She was chattering away about a trip her class was taking to the Natural History Museum.
"They have a whole T-Rex, Daddy, a whole one."
"That's amazing, sweetie," I said, tucking the blankets around her.
"Can we go sometime? You and me and Isabel?
She asked, her voice small and sleepy. My heart clenched. I hadn't realized how much I had spoken of her, how much she had quietly seeped into the fabric of our little life. Maybe, kiddo, I said, my voice thick. We'll see. I kissed her forehead, the familiar, comforting scent of her shampoo filling my senses. I love you to the moon and back.
Love you too,
she murmured, already drifting off. I stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, watching her sleep. This was my world. This was my reality. And it was enough. It had to be. I couldn't give her a mansion or a trust fund, but I could give her this, a father who loved her more than anything. I had to protect that, even if it meant my own heart was breaking. There was a knock on the door. Soft, hesitant. Not the sharp rap of a courier or the heavy knock of a landlord. I walked through my small living room, my heart suddenly beating a frantic, hopeful rhythm that I tried to suppress. I opened the door. It was her. Isabel stood in the dim, flickering light of my apartment hallway. She was wearing the same simple jeans and sweater she'd worn to my workshop, her hair pulled back in a loose, messy ponytail. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She wasn't the CEO. She wasn't the Ice Queen. She looked like a refugee. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I stepped back, holding the door open. She walked past me into the living room, a room filled with my half-finished projects and Maya's scattered toys. She looked so out of place and yet so completely right. She stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. "I'm sorry for disappearing," she said, not looking at me. I had to think. "Isabel," I started, but I didn't know what to say. She finally met my eyes, and I saw the raw vulnerability there, the fear she always tried so hard to hide. "My brother called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning," she said, her voice flat. "He's going to force the vote. And he's going to win. He has the proxies." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "It means I'm out," she said, a bitter, humorless smile touching her lips. "He gets the company. He gets everything." She sank down onto my worn-out sofa, her shoulders slumped. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, all the fight gone out of her. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, my movements automatic. I made 2 mugs of peppermint tea, the way she'd told me she liked it. I brought one to her and sat down in the old armchair opposite the couch. She took the mug, her cold fingers brushing against mine. "He told me he'd back off," she said, staring into the steam. "On one condition." "What condition?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "I issue a public statement that our relationship was a temporary lapse in judgment on my part, that you took advantage of me in a vulnerable state. He wants me to discredit you, to ruin you, to save myself." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't enough for him to win. He had to salt the earth behind him. He had to destroy the one good thing that had come out of her nightmare. "And what did you say?" I asked, my voice quiet. She looked up at me, and her eyes were shining with tears. "I told him to go to hell." A profound, fierce relief washed over me. It was more potent than any adrenaline I had ever felt. So tomorrow, I'm going to walk into that boardroom, and I'm going to lose everything I've worked my entire life to protect," she continued, her voice trembling. "And the stupidest part is, I don't even care. Not about the company. Not about the money." She put the mug down, her hands shaking. "I care that I'm going to lose you." The confession hung in the air, fragile and beautiful. I moved from the chair to the couch, sitting beside her. The space between us was gone. "Isabel," I said,
my voice rough with emotion. "You're not going to lose me."
But how can this work?
She whispered, the question a torrent of all her insecurities.
Look at this place, Leo. Look at me. I'm a mess. I'm bringing chaos and reporters and horrible ex-husbands into your life, into your daughter's life. I'm a burden. Tomorrow, I'll be a disgraced former CEO with nothing.
"You're not a burden," I said, finally reaching out, my hand cupping her cheek. Her skin was soft, and she leaned into my touch like it was an anchor.
You're the bravest person I've ever met, and you're not seeing what I see. What do you see?
She asked, her voice breaking.
I see the woman who, in the middle of a fire, told me to save myself. I see the woman who came to a dusty workshop because she needed something real. I see the woman who just told her monster of a brother to go to hell, even if it cost her everything. I took a breath. I'm in love with that woman. The words were out, my own great, terrifying confession. A sob escaped her lips, a sound of pain and relief all at once. But I have nothing to offer you, she cried softly.
You have everything to offer me, I said, my voice fierce with conviction. Don't you get it? I don't want the CEO. I don't want the Vance fortune. I want you. Tired and scared, and in jeans on my lumpy couch. I gestured around the small apartment. My world is this. It's small. It's sawdust and bedtime stories and worrying about rent. I was terrified it wasn't enough for you. It's the only thing I want, she whispered, her tears flowing freely now. It's all I want. And then there were no more words. I leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't like the hesitant, almost kisses of before. This was a kiss of certainty, of desperation and relief. It was the closing of a chapter and the beginning of another. It tasted of peppermint tea and salt and the promise of something real, something solid, something we could build together. It was the feeling of coming home. In my arms, Isabel Vance wasn't the Ice Queen or the CEO. She was just Isabel. And she was finally safe. The next morning felt different. The air in my small apartment was charged with a new energy, a quiet hum of hope that had been absent for so long. I woke up on the couch, a blanket tucked around me. Isabel was already awake, sitting at my small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. She was on her phone, her face set in a look of grim determination that I recognized. The CEO was back, but this time it felt different. She wasn't fighting for a company. She was fighting for us. Morning, I said, my voice thick with sleep. She looked up, and her severe expression melted into a soft, tired smile. Morning. I let you sleep. You looked exhausted. You're the one who should be exhausted, I said, sitting up. I've never felt more awake, she replied, her eyes clear and focused. I made some calls. An old friend of my father's on the board. A few key investors who always hated Julian's style. It's a long shot, but it's not over yet. She was going to fight. Not because she wanted the company back for its own sake, but because she refused to let her brother win. Refused to let him tear down everything, including her chance at happiness. What can I do? I asked. She looked at me, a tender expression on her face. Just be here, she said. When it's over, just be here. An hour before the board meeting, a sleek black car, one of hers, was waiting. She stood at my door, dressed in a sharp navy suit, her armor for the battle to come. She looked every inch the powerful executive, but when she looked at me, her eyes were soft. Wish me luck, she said. You don't need it, I told her, and I believed it. I leaned in and kissed her, a quick, firm kiss right there in the hallway of my run-down building. It was a promise. I'll be here, I said. After she left, the silence in the apartment was deafening. I paced the floor, my mind racing. I felt useless. She was in a boardroom fighting for her life, and I was here, surrounded by sawdust. Then my eyes landed on the rocking horse. It was almost finished. It just needed the final coat of oil. I went into the workshop, and I worked. I poured all my anxiety, my hope, my love for her into the simple, repetitive motion of rubbing the oil into the wood. The grain popped, the cherry wood glowing with a deep, rich luster. I was building something real and solid and lasting. It was the only way I knew how to fight. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. I cleaned my tools. I swept the floor. I waited. Finally, my phone buzzed. It was her. I answered on the first ring, my heart in my throat. "Leo," she said. Her voice was flat, unreadable. "Isabel? What happened? Are you okay?" There was a pause. Then I heard her take a long, shuddering breath. "We won," she whispered. Relief hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against my workbench for support. "You won? How?" "It was close," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Julian had the votes, just like he thought, but then I talked about the fire. I told them the truth, not the PR version, the real version, about the alarms failing because of budget cuts he had pushed through, about how I was trapped, and about how one of the contractors, a man with a daughter at home, a man who had every reason to run, stayed and carried me out." She paused, and I could hear the emotion thickening her voice. "I told them that they could vote for Julian's vision of this company, a vision of ruthless cost-cutting and zero accountability. Or they could vote for a company that remembers that its greatest asset isn't its stock price, but its people. The people who build it, and the people who, when everything else fails, are willing to run into the fire." She had used our story, not as a PR stunt, but as a testament, as a core value. My father's old friend called for a new vote, a vote of confidence in me. It passed. "And Julian?" I asked. "He's out," she said, a note of finality in her voice. "The board is demanding his resignation." The external threat was neutralized. The battle was over. "Isabel, that's amazing," I said, my voice filled with awe. "I'm on my way," she said. "Don't move." When she arrived, she didn't come in the black car. She came in a taxi. She walked into my workshop, took one look at my face, and broke into a run. I met her in the middle of the room, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. She was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. She buried her face in my neck. "It's over," she murmured into my sawdust-covered shirt. "It's finally over." "It's just beginning," I said. That evening, we sat on my couch, the rocking horse standing in the corner of the room like a silent, gleaming trophy. Maya, home from Mrs. Gable's, was instantly in love with it. She was also instantly in love with Isabel, showing her every one of her dinosaur toys with grave importance. Isabel listened with rapt attention, asking her serious questions about the difference between a stegosaurus and a triceratops. She didn't talk down to her. She treated my daughter with the same respect she would a board member. And watching them, my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. This was it. This was the future. Later, after Maya was asleep, Isabel turned to me, her expression serious. "There's one last piece of business," she said. She pulled a familiar cream-colored envelope from her bag. It wasn't the check. It was a deed. "I bought the building," she said simply. "The foundation did. It's going to be converted into affordable live workspaces for local artisans. Your rent stays the same. Forever." I stared at the papers, speechless. She hadn't just given me a fish. She had secured the whole damn lake for everyone. It wasn't charity. It was a solution. A permanent one. She hadn't just saved me. She had saved my home, my work, my community. "Isabel," I whispered, overwhelmed. "It's not a gift, Leo," she said, taking my hand. "It's an investment. In you. In us. In the kind of world I want to live in." She smiled. "Consider it a mutually beneficial arrangement." I pulled her close, my heart overflowing with a love so profound it almost hurt. "I love you," I said, the words as solid and real as the wood in my hands. "I love you too," she replied, her voice sure and steady. I stood in my workshop a week later, looking through the open door into my apartment. The eviction notice was gone, replaced by one of Maya's drawings. Isabel was in the kitchen, trying to teach my daughter how to make pancakes, and there was more flour on them than in the bowl. The sound of their laughter filled the small space, a sound that was quickly becoming the soundtrack of my life. The weight that had lived in my head for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of peace. I thought back to that night at the lodge, to the smoke and the fear, to the moment a powerful, terrified woman had told me to save myself. I had refused, acting on an instinct I didn't understand. But now I did. In that moment, I hadn't just been saving her. I had been saving myself. I had been running toward the fire, not knowing that everything I had ever wanted was on the other side. That single, crazy decision to stay, to lift her into my arms and carry her through the flames, wasn't the end of my quiet, simple life. It was the start of something real. It was the beginning of our new chapter.